Hi, I'm Steve Clemens, and I have a couple of questions. Has the Middle East averted all-out war? And what are Iran's options now? Let's get to the bottom line. All eyes were on Iran this week, as no one could predict when or if it would respond to Israel's provocations earlier this month. Israel's assassination of the political head of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran, and a senior Hezbollah commander in Lebanon threatened to push the region from the current level of war to a much larger conflict that could drag in U.S. forces directly. But by dangling the possibility of resumed ceasefire talks in Gaza, has the U.S. neutralized the possibility of an Iranian response? And will Hamas, Iran, and Iran's allies in the Middle East decide that it's better to keep their enemies guessing about their next move while delinking retaliation against Israel from the latest American effort on Gaza? Today, we're talking with Trite Parsi, Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and author of Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Israel, Iran, and the United States. Trite, thank you so much for joining us. I want to ask you,
Steve,
how tense a time is this right now when we've had assassinations of the former Prime Minister of Palestine inside Iran, the killing of a significant Hezbollah commander? How fragile is this moment in the Middle East?
You know, we've had a lot of fragile moments in just the last couple of years and plenty of very, very risky situations. But this, I think, is the most fragile, the most difficult one that I can think of for at least the last 15 or so years. When the Israelis choose to assassinate the political leader of Hamas in Tehran, only hours after they assassinated the Hezbollah commander, and the world was waiting to see what Hezbollah's response was. But even before Hezbollah managed to respond, the Israelis struck again. It sent a clear message, in my view, which is that the Israelis were quite willing to risk escalation and perhaps even desire it. And the question now, of course, is what the response will be from Iran, Hezbollah, and other actors in the region.
Well, you've said that, and you've written in Time magazine, but you just said it again, that maybe the Israelis do not want a more stable situation. Perhaps this was done by design. This was done right after the inauguration of Iran's new president. What do you do? What does the United States do if it has a partner in Israel who's very, very focused on there being a wider war?
Well, the Biden administration itself, at a time in unscripted moments, admitted that they do understand that Netanyahu has a political interest of prolonging and expanding the war. Because as I'm sure it's been covered on your show several times, a ceasefire deal will likely collapse Netanyahu's coalition government. Once he is out of government, no longer prime minister, his immunity is gone and he will be charged for corruption. And he will likely end up in jail. So he has a clear personal interest in expanding and continuing the war. The question then is, of course, as you put it, what does the United States do? Well, Biden shouldn't do what he has been doing. What he has been doing is essentially show maximum deference to Netanyahu, even though he understands that Netanyahu's interest is quite clearly different from that of the United States. U.S. interest very clearly is not in favor of a further escalation in the region, and certainly not a war in the region that could drag the United States into it. The question is, of course, then, at what point will Biden show the backbone to actually use the leverage that the United States does have, but that he has chosen not to use thus far, to actually press the Israelis to back off, which is, of course, arms shipments to Israel. Without those arms shipments, the Israelis would not be able to continue the war. According to one Israeli general, they would have to halt the war within 5 days if the United States stopped providing the ammunition and additional weapons.
I'm interested in this political equation of so-called leverage that we seem in the United States unwilling to use. Why do you think that is?
I think Biden made a very strategically flawed calculation from the outset when he bear-hugged Netanyahu, locked himself to Netanyahu's strategy, presuming that Netanyahu would show a degree of reasonableness and presuming that by showing this degree of support to Israel, he would actually gain support within Israeli society, which would then make it more difficult and costly for Netanyahu to oppose Biden or to act against Biden's wishes, which is a completely flawed calculation. Instead, it has led to a situation in which Biden is continuously reacting to Netanyahu, and Netanyahu is in the lead all the time. Let me also mention why I think this strategy that Biden chose has actually fueled escalation in the region in and of itself. If you're sitting in Tehran right now, your key objective is to prevent the Israelis from doing this again. You want to establish some sort of deterrence. They're not looking for a full-scale war. If they were, they had plenty of opportunities to start it. They have refrained from doing so. Even the strikes in April were very clearly designed not to lead to a larger war. Now, how do you then stop the Israelis from being able to do this again? Well, either you have the United States restrain Israel and prevent it from doing so again, given the leverage the U.S. has, or the Iranians are going to have to rely on deterrence, which in and of itself is extremely risky and can cause a broader war. With Biden having shown now for 10 months that he is unwilling to restrain Israel, this leaves the Iranians then with only one option left, which is figure out how they can restore deterrence, how they can strike back without causing a war. If there had been clear evidence that Biden actually is willing to restrain Israel, I think the calculation on the Iranian side would be quite different. Now, there are some efforts going on right now for a last-ditch effort for a ceasefire. There is a certain likelihood that the Iranians will refrain from retaliating if there is a ceasefire. But all of this could have been much, much easier. Not easy, but much easier if there was a factor in this equation, which was, yes, the United States actually is a responsible actor and can restrain Israel when Israel clearly is acting in ways that are escalatory.
Some people would begin to say, maybe Iran, as you've just said, doesn't want a full-on war, but does it run the risk of looking like a paper tiger to its allies, that it's not delivering to its proxies and allies by appearing weak when compared to Israel?
I think this is an absolutely crucial factor in Tehran's calculations. When you take a look at the conduct of some of its partners in the axis of resistance, as they call themselves, it's been clear for the last 10 months, there's a lot of complaints, many of them publicly, by them, particularly the Houthis, but also Iraqi and Syrian militias, who believe that Iran has been, A, showing too much restraint itself. They did not believe in the strategy of strategic patience, and at the same time have been complaining publicly about Iran restraining them and putting pressure on them not to, for instance, strike at U.S. bases. We had one moment in which a spokesperson for the Houthis laughed at the question that the Houthis were a proxy of Iran and said, I can guarantee you, if Iran was calling the shots, if Iran wasn't calling the shots on these different things, if the Houthis were to do exactly what they wanted to, they would not be in a situation in which the Houthis would not be firing at Israel. Houthis are firing at Israel, and it's against Tehran's wishes. Now, that strategy, nevertheless, have had some benefits for the Iranians, and they have evaded what they clearly don't seem to want, which is a direct confrontation with the U.S. But if it leads to a situation in which they are now questioning whether Iran actually is a reliable partner for them, I mean, the assassination in Tehran sends a signal that any of these individuals can be assassinated anywhere, including in Tehran, and that Tehran cannot protect them. If that stands, that will significantly weaken Iran's position. So the Iranians are very concerned about that scenario, of course. But on the other hand, a direct confrontation with the United States, that is a suicidal mission for the Iranians. And we've seen for the last 20, 30 years that they walked a very tightrope there and have avoided a direct confrontation with the US. But the fact that they have to be able to show something, I think also points to the fact that any effort by the Biden administration by just simply moving troops there or sending signals to the Iranians that they will pay a heavy military price if they actually strike back at Israel in a very significant way is not sufficient. If you want the Iranians to not retaliate for this, there has to be more than additional threats. There also has to be some sort of an exit for the Iranians, some sort of a win. If there, for instance, is a ceasefire in Gaza, combined with a ceasefire on the Lebanese-Israeli border, and perhaps something else, something they can point to as this is a strategic win, and as a result, Iran is not going to retaliate. But if there is no such thing on the table, and it's just more additional threats from the United States, then I fear that the balance of the debate in Tehran will be that Iran is actually better off nevertheless retaliating, because otherwise it will be so weak in the region and in front of its partners that it will lose even more leverage.
Do you think there's a risk that Iran could lose control over the actions of some of its proxies in Syria and Lebanon and Yemen, that their disaffection with Iran, if it doesn't take these steps, could lead to an increase in this conflict because they just decide that they are going to take action if Iran doesn't?
Well, take a look at the assassination of Soleimani. With Soleimani, not only because of the position Iran had, but also because of his persona, had far greater discipline amongst many of these different militias. Some of that, or a significant amount of that, was actually lost through that assassination. If you now have a situation in which the Iranians are not responding, the Israelis continue to slaughter Gazans, the U.S. occasionally does target these militias, eventually you have a scenario in which, in that case, they may start acting more independently and disregard Iran's advice. You also have another scenario in which there actually is a major confrontation between Iran, Hezbollah, some of these militias, and Israel. The United States steps into that war, and then any effort for de-escalation will end up becoming much more complicated, because it's not just about Iran or Hezbollah, it's about all of these other groups also abiding by this. And there you may end up in a scenario in which some of them will choose to continue because they have their own interests. Many of these Iraqi militias are doing this because of their sense of revenge against the United States for the US's invasion of Iraq, which is quite different, of course, from Iran's motivations. So the equation is getting more complicated because of the fact that you have more actors in the equation, but also because this narrative that tends to view all of them as just proxies of Iran, which is a narrative that is very strong in Washington, is not entirely true in the first place, but it will become even less true if this situation escalates.
I'm interested in this moment, too, from a Hamas profile. Why would it just immediately tip into what Joe Biden wants, which is a deal? What are Hamas's incentives and disincentives in this moment?
Well, Hamas wanted a deal very early on. It's Biden that has become, arrived at that position somewhat late. Remember, in the United States, Biden wouldn't even use the word ceasefire for the first 2 or 3 months. Hamas offered a ceasefire a couple of days after October 7th. Understandably, at that time, the Israelis were not interested in it. But then there have, of course, been plenty of other opportunities in which Netanyahu has deliberately sabotaged those talks. But the broader gist of your question is absolutely right. After having killed the actual negotiator, I mean, if there ever was any question as to whether Netanyahu was interested in a deal, having killed the negotiator of the other side should settle that debate, and we should move on when it comes to debates about Netanyahu's intentions.
Tell us what you know about Masoud Pezeshkian, the new president of Iran, and what he wants, maybe not just what he wants, what can he get? He's publicly said, you wrote about this, that he believes that better relations or more relaxed tensions with the United States are vital to Iran's economy. Has that all just been blown up?
Well, I think Netanyahu was hoping to close the window that had been created, surprisingly, with Pezeshkian's election. As you know, Netanyahu and Israel as a whole have opposed U.S.-Iran diplomacy since the mid-1990s. And Netanyahu himself has made it a cause célèbre for him. He's personified the idea of stopping a U.S.-Iran diplomatic engagement that leads to a nuclear deal. And he's taking credit for having killed a nuclear deal by convincing Trump to withdraw from it. So seeing that suddenly, quite unexpectedly, there was now a window for renewed Iran-U.S. diplomacy because of Pezeshkian's election victory, I think was something that Netanyahu saw as a threat and realized that if he did something like this, very daring, in Tehran itself, on the day of his inauguration, that it would make it all the more difficult for Pezeshkian to be able to get to that level of sustained diplomacy that is needed to actually resolve not only the nuclear issue, but some other points of tensions between the Iran and the United States. And in that, at least in the short term, he has succeeded. Whether he will succeed in the medium and the long term, of course, depends on what happens next. But Pezeshkian made it very clear in his election campaign that the economic issue, the economic woes of Iran is a foreign policy issue. that sanctions that the US has imposed on Iran are necessary for Iran's economy to be able to function. The strategy that the Iranians have been pursuing for the last couple of years, after they concluded that the United States is incapable and unwilling to offer sustained sanctions relief, is that they stopped looking for sanctions relief and instead shifted towards sanctions neutralization, meaning that they intensified trade with neighboring states in non-US dollars, and as a result sought to have a trade that was protected from US sanctions. Well, that is important from their standpoint, and Pezeshkian is not abandoning that approach. He wants to see it complemented with some sanctions relief that allows Iran to be a recipient of international investments, which it is in dire need of. But that cannot happen unless there is at least some sort of an agreement between the United States and Iran. And his entire presidency may crash over this issue.
Trite, I don't know whether you have good inroads into what the average Iranian citizen is feeling at this moment. Are they comfortable with being members of the axis of resistance and leading that? Are they comfortable, and do they want to see a strike back at Israel? Do they have other objectives that might be closer to what Pezeshkian wanted and set out at the beginning? How do you feel like the average Iranian is feeling in this moment?
Well, the issue is that there is no such thing as an average Iranian. This is a society that is quite divided along these lines. You definitely have a segment of society that believes that what is happening between Israel and Palestine in general, perhaps their views have changed a little bit, mindful of the genocide going on. But in general, they tend to be sympathetic to the Palestinians quite overwhelmingly, but don't believe that that is Iran's fight to engage in, and are quite critical of their perception of how much money Iran is spending on some of these different groups, and don't see this axis of something to be proud of. But you have another segment of society as well that feel quite strongly about these issues, whether it's because of religious issues or ideological reasons, but also a very clear segment of society that perhaps transcends these both groups, that also understand that Iran is in a neighborhood famously that is quite tough. They see an America that is very hostile. Yes, Iran is hostile to the United States as well, but there's a very important data point here. Iran did sign the JCPOA. Iran agreed and lived up to the Iran nuclear deal. The United States was the party that withdrew from it. And I think that poked a huge hole in the idea that all of this enmity is just simply because of the radicalism of the United States, of the Islamic Republic. That certainly is a factor. But you also have another factor, which is that hostility towards Iran tends to be politically attractive for politicians in the United States. Obama proved himself to be a major exception. And on top of that, you also saw things such as when ISIS emerged, in which Iran's investment in some of these groups proved crucial in defeating ISIS. And after ISIS showed such a strong anti-Shia sentiments and killed such a large number of Shias, a lot of people inside of Iran also recognized that they would be coming against Iran at some point had it not been for Iran developing these relations with these different tribal groups and being able to stop ISIS before it even reached Iran's borders. So it's a complicated picture in the sense that it is not as simplistic as the narrative in Washington is, in which these are just radical groups and it's completely unnecessary for Iran to have any involvement or support for them.
Now we've got a Democratic National Convention coming up in Chicago shortly after the resumption of ceasefire talks. And I'm interested in the timing. How important an equity is it to Kamala Harris, Vice President of the United States, running for President of the United States, to demonstrate a progress in defusing this war and conflict, and also beginning to focus on the plight of Gazans who've been dislodged and so many killed in this conflict?
I think it's absolutely crucial. Now, of course, she is not in charge of policy at this point. There's only one president at a time. But this is, of course, a very unusual situation. Biden did not resign voluntarily. It's quite clear that he had to be pressed immensely before he eventually yielded. So I'm so sure that there's quite a lot of disarray and tensions in the White House right now, exactly where the balance of the policy should be. But from Harris's standpoint, it is crucial to be able to show some degree of progress. Because if she is faced with the same situation as Biden in terms of just continuing the Biden policy, but just sprinkling nicer words and tone and rhetoric around it, that may work for a week or two, but there's clear signs already that it's not working long enough. People want to see a policy change. And the uncommitted movement that have proven crucial in certain states, particularly Michigan, are not going to become recommitted just because of a tone and rhetorical change. They will require policy shifts. And while it's difficult for Harris perhaps to make too strong promises on that ground, if she can point to progress that is happening right now and perhaps even take some credit for it, that I think can go a very long way in injecting the type of confidence that is needed for a lot of those voters to come back to her. And I think it would be a huge mistake from her end to calculate that she has just generated so much energy in the campaign right now, and she has, that it is sufficient and she doesn't need some of these communities. She definitely does need them, particularly in certain states. And beyond that, it's actually also good for herself because she does not want to enter the White House in case she wins with this crisis still in an escalatory stage.
Do you think they're in a box, Trita, with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, in the sense that if there is a shift away from him at some point to a different government, whether it's headed by Benny Gantz or others, has their alliance and their steadfast support of Israel's actions thus far locked them into Netanyahu's crafted side, created an inability to shift?
Yeah, I absolutely. I think essentially Biden deliberately, willingly locked himself to Netanyahu in an extremely unwise manner, given Netanyahu's track record. And he saw what Netanyahu did to Biden's former boss, Obama. So to extend that degree of trust to Netanyahu just because you have sympathy with Israel after October 7th is just strategically incomprehensible. And now he's paying the price for it. And America's paying the price for it. And of course, the Palestinians are paying the price for it. And soon perhaps the rest of the region will as well if Netanyahu continues to get his way. Harris needs to unlock herself from Netanyahu, but also unlock herself from this broader approach towards Israel, which is that there is this knee-jerk deference and then thinking and decision-making afterwards. That is not going to work because Israel is right now the country, the partner of the United States that is most likely to drag the United States into another war in the Middle East. And whatever one thinks about the politics of Israel in Washington and whether it's changed much or whether it hasn't changed, what has changed on both the Republican and the Democratic side is that if you are a president that allows the United States to get dragged in to another war in the Middle East, then you will lose your next election.
Right. Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much. Trite Parsi, Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
So what's the bottom line? Decades ago, Iran might have accepted a deal with the U.S. that allows it to conduct nuclear energy research and development with severely constrained centrifuge construction and law of the land weapons inspections. But now things have changed. Relations between the U.S. are on a hot simmer. The U.S. and its European allies had put Iran's nuclear program in a box, and then Donald Trump ripped open that box. Today, Iran is more powerful, and it is